Okay, welcome. My name is Mark Csikszentmihalyi. I'm on behalf of the Berkeley Public Theology Program and Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, and my co-director, Jonathan Sheehan. I'd like to welcome you to today's event. I also wanted to note that there's a sign-up outside for our newsletter, our weekly newsletter, so you can know about these things far in advance. And I also wanted to note that we have two events coming up. A week from today, there's an all-day workshop on what comes after the critique of secularism. That's Thursday of next week from 8 to 5 in 3335 Dwinell. And in 3 weeks, the Berkeley Lecture on Religious Tolerance will be given by Karen Barkey of the Sociology Department here. And the title is Living with Difference, Shared Religious Sanctuaries in the Ottoman Lands. So that's Wednesday, April 26th at 5 p.m. in Banatow Auditorium. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Hymes. Robert Hymes graduated from Columbia College and received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And he's returned to Columbia as the Horace Walpole Carpentier Professor of Oriental Studies at Columbia, where he also has been chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures for 10 years. He's the only person to have twice received the Joseph Levinson Prize of the Association for Asian Studies for the best book on China. He received it in 1986. What?
Best book on China before.
Before 1900.
Well, but no one has received it for any period in Chinese history, so he is literally the only person to twice receive the Levinson Prize. He received it in 1986 for Statesman and Gentleman, the elite of Fuzhou, Jiangxi, and in the northern southern Song, and again in 2002 for Wei and Bai Wei, Taoism, Local Religion, and Models of Divinity in Song and Modern China. Now the former is an important work that's played a role in the revival of interest in the Tang-Song transition in China today, and the latter is groundbreaking in its approach to Chinese Taoism, paying close attention to sources of social and cultural history in order to construct a more complex picture of Chinese religiosity. Wei and Bai Wei contrast the Three Immortals cult and Celestial Heart Taoism on Mount Huakai, and Hymes uses the contrast to explain the difference between personal and bureaucratic modes of interaction with the divine in Song period Chinese religion. He's currently working on two projects. One is on the plague, and the other is on the basis is the basis of tonight's talk. And there are two handouts on the table outside if you don't have them. And so today, Robert Hymes will be speaking on dangerous belief, Xin, in the occult anecdotes in Tang and Song China.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Mark, and thanks to the center, and thanks to all of you for coming. I will semi-apologize in advance that this is work in progress, but what I've done here is taken new material that it comes from a recent part of the project, and used older material that I've been working on for some time to lead up to it, to try to make sense of the questions I'm asking about Tang Dynasty material, frankly, with the background of my previous Song work. A very few of you, I hope, heard a previous talk that I gave here at Berkeley that covered some of the same material on the Song, so pardon me for the overlap, but as a way of making sense to myself what I was doing in the Tang and trying to present it, it seemed necessary. So I'll begin. I'm talking about belief. I'm talking about Xin, and I will try to make it clear as I go along what kind of belief it is I'm talking about and what kind of belief or other thing that Xin might mean I'm talking about less, although I will touch on it. And I hope you all have the handouts because they're very important, because last night I ripped those quotations out of the paper in order that they could be in a handout so you could all follow them and I wouldn't have to read them to you. So you need them. In any case, you should look at passage number 1 on the handout of passages, and I will read along with you in this case. In a 9th century occult anecdote included in the Taiping Guangji, which is a 10th century compendium of occult anecdotes drawn from collections of the Tang Dynasty, which are the 7th to the 10th centuries, 618 to 907, we find a story about a recluse, or I should say an anecdote, I will stick to the word anecdote, about a recluse with awesome powers. In Shandong, there was a certain recluse Cheng who possessed talismanic arts. When Liu Wu was Zelu military commissioner, the family of the Linjiao County commoner Xiao Jiping was very rich. One day he died suddenly without having been sick. The recluse had received generous favors from Jiping, and when he heard he was dead, he wrote at once to see him and said to his son, "Your father was not supposed to have died. He has probably been summoned by a mountain spirit, and if I treat him, he may still be brought to life." Thereupon he wrote a talisman in red, it's important that it's in red, you'll see further on, and threw it up in the air, and in barely a moment, Jiping did revive. The son asked his father, "Where had you gone before?" Jiping said, "Today I had just gotten up when suddenly I saw a person clothed in green who said that the god of Mount Hua had summoned me. Accordingly, I traveled together with this messenger for about 50 li, where we encountered, descending to us from the air, a man dressed in red and carrying a sword, with a furious look, who said to me, 'Cheng the spirit-ill exterminator is summoning you. You should go at once.' At this, the green-clothed person rode off as if terrified. The red-clothed man had led me back with him to here, where in a moment I became conscious, as if awaking from drunkenness." His family was frightened and amazed and pressed the recluse to explain, saying, "Who is this one called Cheng the spirit-ill exterminator?" The recluse said, "I learned from I'm a little unclear on this, the preceptrix Ms. Gui, I think, and I can't identify her, the talisman registers of Mount Longhu for exterminating spirit-ills," and he undid the register pouch that he wore on his belt to show them. Only then did people believe that it was not deception. The recluse later traveled Min and Yue. I do not know where he ended up. This anecdote has just one thing in common with one that a man named Hong Mai in the Song Dynasty included in his own collection of occult gossip, The Record of the Listener, or Yi Jian Zhi, in the 12th century. The commonality lies in how the anecdote evaluates believing, xin. And you'll see this in passage number 2 on the passage handout. Song 4, and that does seem to be his name, 4, a man of Fuli County in Suzhou, Huainan East Circuit, that's not in the text, lived above the Sui River. His family had always been wealthy, and he was fond of food and drink. He brewed wine to sell, he would roast turtle and slice up carp, and he ate his fill day and night. Doesn't sound like a problem, right? Unless you know why it's a problem. His wife, Ms. Yuan, understood and catered to his wishes. She would always personally wield the blade, and the living things who she had killed are beyond listing. Yuan died in childbirth, and Song 4 never stopped thinking about her. People in his neighborhood were making pilgrimage to Mount Tai for the first day of spring, and Song, wanting to aid his wife's salvation, went along, bringing offerings to present. Once he reached Tai'an, he did not ascend the mountain for 3 days. He was strolling about in the city when in broad daylight he encountered Yuan, his wife, his dead wife, accompanied by several people. Utterly confused, he was both grieving and delighted, and they exchanged accounts of what had happened during their long separation. Sobbing, Yuan said, "Because I butchered fish and turtles," pardon me if I don't affect the sobs in my presentation, "my accumulated karma is very deep, and I am tortured every day. If you pity me, you should think about how to rescue me." Song wept and said, "It was the evil I did that brought you to this. I would be better off dead than alive. There is nothing I would stint in the way of Taoist or Buddhist disciplines, even if it utterly sweeps away my family's wealth." Yuan said, "There's no need for lots of talk. Tomorrow, between the Shun and Yo hours, about 5 p.m., you should go alone to the shrine of the god of Mount Tai. Go to a spot on the north side of the western corridor and watch me." I think that maybe should be "watch for me," and all this should become believable. Song returned to the house he was staying in and fasted and cleansed himself. At the appointed hour he went and saw Yuan being harshly punished in shackles and handcuffs, belted in a curtain by which she was dragged along, I'm not sure about the translation here, with a crowd of ghosts driving her forward. They took off the implements and removed her garment, bound her up in a straw mat, and used a scythe blade to slice her into pieces as fine as thread. The flowing blood turned the ground to mud. In a moment, a single ghost brought a cup of water, called her name, and spit it out on her, and at once she returned to her old form as her body reassembles itself. Suddenly, it all happened again. So they're cutting her up and reassembling her and cutting her up and reassembling her. In all, they did it 6 or 7 times, and then they put the implements back on, and the crowd pushed her off again. In grief and fear, Song went out the gate, and for a day and night did not sleep. Again the next day they met, and Yuan asked, "Do you believe?" He said, "I believe now." She said, "I beg you not to break your promise." Weeping bitterly, they parted. After Song returned home, he extended his strength to the utmost in seeking good karmic fruits, and to the end of his life, he never again killed a living thing. In both these anecdotes, characters come to believe something, and the teller of the anecdote makes clear that what they have come to believe is correct. In the Tang anecdote, we are not actually told that Xiao Jiping's family do not believe his story of a spirit journey and his rescue by Cheng, only that they are frightened and amazed, but after they see the evidence, in telling us, quote, only then did people believe that it was not deception, unquote, the narrator tells us that they had disbelieved before. In Hong Mai's story, Tsong Fo does not appear to disbelieve his wife's story of afterlife punishment. When he first hears it, he is merely utterly confused and seems to know that he's looking at something that's real, but in asking him to witness her punishment so that things should become believable or should be believable, she implies that he doesn't quite believe, and the final change of state particle yi in his later response, xin yi, I believe now, I have come to believe, as my translation, I believe now, emphasizes, implies that perhaps he had not. Thus, in both anecdotes, we find a passage from earlier implied incorrect disbelief to explicit correct belief. Both anecdotes end with the key characters believing. The two are similar in tracing the same passage to believing, but in their relation to their respective collections, they are direct opposites. And the difference, I'm going to argue, suggests a large change in how believing was regarded between Tang and Song. I'm presenting, as I've said, the most recent but not the final part of a continuing inquiry into believing in the middle period that has encompassed several stages based in distinct sources. For Tang-Song comparison, I will say the evidence has obvious limits. The data I will offer for Tang and 5 dynasties in being drawn from a single early Song compendium of mostly occult stories are skeletal and may always remain so for lack of adequate Tang sources. My Hong Mai evidence is still incomplete, drawn from only the first 40% or so of his collection. I stopped at a certain point when the patterns didn't seem to be changing, but I have to go back and do the rest. It is an oddity, too, to base a claim of Tang-Song change on a comparison between Tang and 5 dynasties on the one hand, 8th to 10th centuries, and Southern Song materials, 12th century, on the other, and it will obviously be important in the long run to fill in the space between. Northern Song material from the 10th and 11th centuries, when explored, may show that the Tang-Song difference that I'm claiming is largely the product of changes internal to the Song. Finally, as a Song specialist, I've been haunted in this stage of research by a sense that questions carried to Tang from Song may not be fully Tang appropriate in a certain sense. This concern now looks at least partly mitigated by a finding of strong difference between the dynasties. But still, because the project's current question has emerged, first of all, from the Song and has then been applied to Tang sources, I'll proceed by tracing the Song inquiries and findings so as to make clear where the questions came from. The order of presentation will thus echo the order of investigation and will not be chronological, except chronological in my life. After a significant Song detour, I'll return to the Tang, and perhaps the cumulative Song evidence may make it more plausible that the Tang difference is meaningful. That is sort of how it has worked for me. Some years ago, I began translating a Southern Song Pure Land Buddhist tract, the Writings on the Pure Land from Longshu, by the lay Buddhist Wang Ruxiu, who died in 1173. The book was prefaced in 1161. Wang had been an examination candidate and commentator on the Confucian classics, but threw all this over to turn to Buddhist cultivation instead, and specifically Pure Land Buddhism. There were many reasons for me to be interested in Wang, but what I found in his first chapter surprised me. The chapter is entitled Jingtu Qi Xin, roughly, the initiation or stimulation or perhaps awakening of Xin in relation to the Pure Land. I assumed that Xin in such a work, when I first looked at it, would mean faith, since the standard Intro to Chinese Civilization account of Pure Land Buddhism tells us that it focuses on faith in its patron Bodhisattva Amitabha as the source of rescue through rebirth in the Pure Land, a final way station toward the true salvation of nirvana. But the Xin in the initiation of Xin in Wang Ruxiu's first chapter seems to have little to do with faith, as I think most students or practitioners of religion might understand it, and everything to do, as it turns out, with propositional belief. For Wang Ruxiu, the chief obstacle that many people face to the first step onto a path of Pure Land conduct is a failure to believe certain simple propositions that Wang regards as merely factual. For instance, that there exists a clean and pure Buddha land, that the route into that land is rebirth in a lotus blossom, that those who reside there enjoy immeasurably long life, that clothes and food come into existence by themselves there, and that there is pure and simple happiness there. The consequence of conceiving Xin in this way is that Wang also treats the long-established opposite of Xin in Buddhist discourse, doubt, or doubting, Yi, not as general uncertainty or apprehension about the Buddhist enterprise or uncertainty that one can get there, but as factual doubt of specific propositions. So, for instance, quote, someone might doubt it, that is, the existence of the Pure Land and its qualities, saying, when people in this world recite Amitabha's name, how can they be born at once into a single bud of a lotus flower in the Seven Treasures Pond in the Western region? And again, quote, someone might doubt it further, saying, it is said that Amitabha always dwells above the head of the person who's reciting his name and protects him. If the immeasurable worlds contain an immeasurable myriad living beings who recite the true words, how can Amitabha dwell above the head of each one everywhere? Or, quote, someone whose cultivation is more finely advanced might doubt it, saying, there is also the time of approaching death, when the Buddha and Bodhisattvas come and escort the departing one, it is said. Yet if the worlds in all directions contain an immeasurable myriad of living beings who are finely advanced, how can the Buddha and Bodhisattvas know the moments of death of all to come and escort them? Wang's imagined doubters are, in the most literal terms, questioning the possibility that certain Pure Land claims could be factual. To such imagined questioning, Wang responds with rational argument, usually based in analogy. I use the term rational argument to mean argument that brings reasons to bear, argument that is not by authority or whim, but actually tries to persuade using reasons. We don't tend to think that arguments from analogy are necessarily winning arguments today, but in the Song Dynasty, this was a very common form of rational argument. Usually based in analogy, clearly assuming that propositional doubt can be fairly quickly overcome by showing known parallels to each of the propositions doubted. To the problem of Amitabha dwelling above every single head, for example, Wang offers, and the full version is number 3 on your handout, but I will just read his response, which is, I say, this too is merely natural. Compare it to the single moon up in the sky, which appears universally in all rivers. How is this not natural? So just as the moon can be reflected in all rivers simultaneously, they didn't know about the two sides of the world, the Amitabha can stand above the head of every person, directly above. In the end, Wang suggests, such failures of belief are failures of imagination, reflecting the limits of people's experiences in the world. And actually, might want to look at the handout myself, because this is an important one. Sorry. Here we have, on the handout, passage number 4, where he's telling us the reasons why people who live in the ordinary world can't imagine the glories and beauties of the Pure Land. Living in this muddy world of Saha, they do not believe that there exists a pure and clean Buddha land. And skipping over much of it, the key line is at the end. If this is so, then what a Buddha says should not be disbelieved because one has not seen it with one's own eyes. The idea is that only having seen certain kinds of things with one's own eyes, one cannot imagine something like the world of the Pure Land. Wang goes on to provide reasons why a Buddha would not lie or deceive, it's a very interesting section of his work, a charge that not even Hanyu in his vicious attack on Buddhism in the Tang had leveled, and a suggestion that surely a Buddhist author would not put into his skeptical audience's heads unless he thought it was, for them, a likely response to difficult propositions. He hopes to knock down disbelief in this first chapter, and the real shortage of references to Xin in the remaining 9 chapters of his book, which deal almost entirely with practice, make clear that he sees the acquisition of simple and straightforward belief of these propositions as the prerequisite that, once achieved, will allow the Pure Land cultivator to advance along the path in expectation of possible success. Wang thinks belief, though crucial, can be quick. What makes Wang's propositional treatment of Xin surprising is that his chapter title directly echoed in the phrase Qi Xin, directly echoed in a way he had to know a predecessor text several hundred years old and well known by his time on the initiation of Xin of the Great Vehicle, the Dasheng Qi Xin Lun, known in its standard English translation by Yoshito Hakeda as the Awakening of Faith. Though traditionally the work was ascribed to Indian authorship and translation, most scholars now believe that it was in fact created in China in the middle to late 6th century, within shouting distance of the Tang when it exerted considerable influence. The work's treatment of Xin does not lack what at least grammatically are propositions. Thus, the author recommends Xin in 4 varieties, and this is on your handout, passage number 5. And I would just call your attention to the 3 of the items to which Xin are directed that are in fact propositions or can be read as such. That the Buddhas have numberless excellent qualities, that the Dharma teaching has great benefits, and that the Sangha, Buddhist community, have the capacity to devote themselves to the practice of benefiting both themselves and others. These are objects of Xin, whatever we choose to call Xin. You're supposed to Xin these things. In principle, these last 3 objects of Xin are all propositions. Yet unlike Wang, the author of the Dashang Qishan Lun nowhere tries to persuade the reader of any of these propositions, never treats them as potential objects of doubt or disbelief for anyone, and never unpacks them in terms of other or component or parallel propositions, as Wang Zhixiu does for his. Instead, for each of the 3, he turns immediately to its expression as in practice, which Wang had left for discussion in his last 9 chapters, after the switch of necessary propositional belief is apparently pulled by reading the first chapter. It is not their propositionality that interests the Dashang Qishan Lun author in these 3 things, and notice that the first of the thing is supposed to Xin is not a proposition at all. More important, but their effects, not their propositionality, but their effects. More important still is the Dashang Qishan Lun author conceives achieving Changjiu Xin, or in Hakeda's rendering, perfecting it, as both difficult and slow. And we can see this if you look at passage number 6 on the handout, where the lines I've bolded have to do with the achievement of Xin. By whom and through what kind of discipline can Xin be achieved? Hakeda would say perfected. And then later, talking about a particular group of devotees, their Xin heart will be achieved after 10,000 eons. So Xin is not something that you just get a good explanation of why a certain proposition makes sense, assent to it, and then you can go on to practice. Xin is something that it seems takes a long time to properly develop and achieve. And the hint here that Xin, rather than being a prerequisite to practice, is strengthened through practice, is rendered explicit elsewhere. This, I believe, is also on the... No, this one is not, so I'll just read it to you. There are 5 ways of practice that will enable a man to perfect or complete or achieve his Xin. They are the practices of charity, observance of precepts, patience, zeal, and cessation of illusions, and clear observation. Question: how should a man practice charity? Answer: if he sees anyone coming to him begging, he should give him the wealth and other things in his possession insofar as he is able. Thus, while freeing himself from greed and avarice, he causes the beggar to be joyful. And the important thing to see is that this is one of the practices that is a way to Xin, a way to developing Xin, not something that you will do after you've achieved Xin, as Wang Zhixiu would undoubtedly present it. He talks about charitable behavior and so on in his later chapters, but the people who are engaging in that have already reached Xin by simply believing the propositions about the Pure Land. In this picture of something that accompanies one through eons, always being developed, and that both supports practice and is perfected through it, I think we find good reason for Hakeda's decision to translate Xin in this work as faith rather than belief. But it is clear that Wang Zhixiu, in adopting his chapter title from the older text, kind of ignored what the older text meant by it, and gave Xin a sharply propositional and argument-oriented twist. So I asked, when I came across this and worked on it for a while, was there something in the intellectual and cultural surroundings of Wang's time that made it seem natural to focus on simple belief of propositions as the chief obstacle that his probably largely gentlemanly audience would face? In fact, I think he paradoxically chose to tackle one of the notions most problematic for his time and audience, and it was my encounter with his version of Xin that first interested me in taking up the place of Xin in the intellectual and cultural context of his time as a topic of new research. The first 2 stages of that research addressed 2 very different large bodies of source material, both roughly contemporaneous with Wang Zhixiu, since I was interested in, what context is this happening in? Both using Xin overwhelmingly to mean propositional belief, showing somewhat different patterns in its use, but alike in suggesting, through the collective weight of their handling of the word, that in urging belief, Wang was stepping into highly problematic territory in his time. In brief, Both the late Southern Song collection of legal judgments, entitled A Pure and Brilliant Collection of Written Judgments by Famous Gentlemen, and Hung Mai's Record of the Listener, the collection of occult anecdotes that we saw a story from before, though comprising very different kinds of texts, can be read, completely different genres of text, can be read to suggest that belief was seen by judges and by the tellers of occult anecdotes as a potentially dangerous or difficult thing, and thus to make Wang Erxiu's rhetorical strategy look both striking and a little strange. Now, one might expect a collection of legal judgments dealing with cases ranging from property disputes to violent crime, and sometimes both at once, to dwell on the claims of opposing parties, and so on the question of whom the judge could believe among them, whom he could shin. And in fact, as one might expect, more than 250 of the 400-some judgments contain references to deliberate falsehood or fakery or lying on the litigant's part. The judge identifies somebody as having lied or deceived or misrepresented. Yet the word shin itself occurs much less often, 52 times to be exact, and judges' use of the word is colored in a very particular way. And for this, I would urge you to accompany me with table number 1 in the handout of tables, which is the table of cases of shin and bu shin in this collection of judgments. To sum up what's there, but I should hold it in front of me, briefly, any party to the litigations who is said to believe something turns out to be wrong, with a tiny few exceptions. 5 litigants believe, and all are wrong. 4 officials other than the judge believe, and all are wrong. Only the judge himself is ever right to believe, but a judge admits to believing something only 5 times in all 400 cases, and in 2 of those cases, 5 cases, even he is wrong. And now I would ask you to move to passage number 7 on the passages handout. Seven and 8, in fact, where we'll see the 2 cases where a judge represents himself as having believed something to start with and then to have discovered that he was wrong in the course of the case. In the first one, he's interviewing a young official, finding his answers mostly convincing, and he says, "I believed all the more that the county administrator was of high wisdom." But then, in part I have not quoted, he goes on through a longer segment of the case to find out all the ways in which he was wrong in thinking this, and this guy's not a good administrator at all. And in passage number 8, we find that an earlier judicial intendant believed it was a concluded case, the case he's now looking at, the judge is now looking at. "I believed it too at the beginning, then at the end, but only now have I come to know that the case was never completed and that a convict has never submitted." In these cases, we see shin turning out for the judge, by the end of the judgment, pretty much as badly as it does for all other believers in this collection. A third judge, by contrast, after summoning a previously accused party for lengthy testimony, does express his final, definitive, and in his view, obviously correct judgment in terms of shin, and this is number 9 on the handout, where he says, "I still believed Huang Ming's questioning had been thorough, his answers had been full, and his account of events must be true. Thus, I send Liu in custody to jail," another party to the trial, "and put it in writing." So this is a case where the judge actually ends by saying that he believes somebody, and he's reached his decision through believing that person. That's unique in the entire collection of 400 cases. Judges just don't usually say that. There are, as I've said, 2 other cases where they indicate belief of a party to the judgment, but the way they do it is by saying, instead of writing, "I believed," the judge relocates his attitude in the phenomena themselves by characterizing a party's testimony simply as believable, 可信. Thus, in one of these 2 cases we find, and these are not on the handout, what he said about the collateral for the loan and how he paid the debt as promised is quite believable in one case. And in another case, more interesting one really, quote, "I have also summoned neighbors to verify the testimony and be questioned, and among them it is most of all Ah Yao, whose testimony is clearly believable. Thus it is clear that Wang Zhen, while drunk, outraged Ah Zhang," unquote. If you'd like to know more about those characters, I can give you the citation. It is tempting to read this usage, at least it's tempting to me, to read this usage as a transfer of responsibility for belief from judge to world, from judge to propositions. And again, in the 5 cases in which judges do articulate a positively believing attitude with respect to something through one of these phrases, they use this passive construction 3 times out of the 5. The same passivizing is common when judges disbelieve, which they do much more often than they believe, 28 times, more than half of all the instances of the word shin in the collection. And when they do so, it turns out they were right to disbelieve in 26 of the 28 cases. Belief is unsuccessful, disbelief is successful. But again, and this is what's interesting, they do not usually record themselves simply as not believing, bushin. Instead, in 21 of the 28 cases, they turn the tables again and relocate their disbelief in the propositions themselves, calling a party's statement unbelievable, bukashin, not worth believing, buzushin, or the like. In all, only 9 of the 33 cases in which a judge uses the word shin to articulate his attitude or judgment toward testimony does he write bluntly, I believe, or I believed, or I disbelieved. Attributing believability or unbelievability to others, it seems, is rhetorically preferable to attributing belief or even disbelief to oneself. It is as if there is something difficult about writing, I believed or I disbelieved. One judge does I believed in 400 cases. The association of, even though they're always talking about how everybody's lying, the association of belief with wrongness throughout the collection might explain the former not saying I believed, but judges who find things unbelievable are almost always right. So where exactly is the difficulty in writing simply I disbelieved, which they do only 7 times in the collection? Now, could we explain this generically? And throughout this project, I've been haunted by and at the same time battling purely genre-based explanations of what's going on in all of the texts that I'm looking at. And I'm kind of satisfied that typical genre-based explanations don't work. But could we explain it in a genre-based way through judges' presumable need to maintain their authority as final deciders? I believe and I disbelieve are acknowledgments of uncertainty, different from it is clear in the previous example, for instance, and perhaps a judge cannot easily admit uncertainty without undermining his own authority. Cannot be believed, by contrast, appears certain. Yet the problem is that judges do associate themselves with uncertainty, largely through belief's opposite, again, doubt. Yi. Doubting, after all, is as uncertain, as different in principle from knowledge as belief may be. Yet judges in this collection sometimes work their way through a case by noting each point that they doubt in the testimony they have received. They, too, tend to locate their attitude in the phenomena by saying, this was the first dubitable point, kayija, or simply kayi. This was the second dubitable point, and so on, until after a series of dubitable points, which ranges from 1 to 5, they have worked their way to certainty. This rhetorical strategy constructs a narrative by admitting the uncertainty of the real situation for a time and the uncertainty of the appropriate judgment until one has made one's way through each doubtful point in sequence. Apparently, the judge's authority poses no obstacle to recounting his own temporary uncertainty. It is unclear then, just to make something up, it is unclear why a judge's need to maintain authority would not let him work his way through uncertainty via a series of believable points, for instance. Similarly, relocating his own attitude in the phenomena for safety's sake. You can imagine a judge writing, this was the first believable point, this was the second believable point, and so on until with enough believable points he's added up to something like certainty. Yet, as we have seen, there are only 3 occurrences of the phrase believable, kashin, in all 400 plus judgments. In some legal judgments, I have concluded something is wrong with believing. Those who do it are always wrong, except judges. Judges rarely do it, are wrong 2 to 1 when they write I believed as opposed to it was believable, and prefer to locate even their highly preferred disbelief in phenomena, in propositions, as unbelievability rather than in themselves. This brings us back to Hong Mai, through whose work we can finally come back to Tang-Song comparison. And it'll take a little time. The story of Tsong 4 that I began with is utterly atypical of Hong's anecdotes, and for this, please look at Table 2 in the handout of tables, which I hope will be clear enough on examination, but I'll be filling out some of the parts of it for you as we go along. Tsong 4's story is utterly atypical of Hong's anecdotes in 2 crucial ways. First, it presents us with an act of believing that is correct. And second, it ends with the main character in a state of belief, having moved there from a state, or so his wife implies, it's not that clear, a bit closer to disbelief. Yet out of 29 anecdotes in the sampled sections of the record in which a character is said to believe, expressed either by Shin or by Yiweiran, take something to be so, which is only a few of the cases, the belief turns out to be correct in only 5 cases, or 17% of the time. Furthermore, in only 2 of the 215 anecdotes that I've read on this topic does a character come to the end of the story in a state of what the narrator calls Shin. Instead, if a character has believed or disbelieved something, and afterward it has turned out that the contrary is true, in a tiny few cases he may then be shown realizing Wu or knowing Zhi, the truth, or simply being afraid upon discovering it, but in the overwhelming majority of anecdotes, the real state of affairs is by the end simply self-evident to the characters, except those who have died in the process, and the reader alike. So do Hong's characters do better if when confronted by another character's proposition or representation of things they don't believe it? Well, no. In fact, when they disbelieve, expressed by Bushin and certain other expressions you'll see in the table, they are wrong without exception, 62 times out of 62. This impression of utter futility is somewhat mitigated. First of all, I think it will be mitigated when I've read the other 60% of the collection. I think some cases of correct disbelief will show up. But more importantly, it's mitigated already when one notes that not believing in these anecdotes has a close synonym in doubting. Again, Yi, the judge's friend from the written judgments. If a character doubts another's proposition or representation of things, he has a chance of being right, 6 times out of 19. But again, either doubt or disbelief, when either doubt or disbelief is explicit, the character's realization of his or her mistake by the end of the anecdote is never characterized as Shin. The movement from disbelief to belief that we see fairly explicitly in the Tang anecdote with which I began, and less explicitly as to disbelief in Hong Mai's story of Tsongfor, is never explicitly articulated for both halves of the process in Hong Mai's anecdotes. Never is somebody explicitly said to Bushin and at the end explicitly said to Shin. Just doesn't happen in 215 cases. Maybe we'll see it happen. So are Hong Mai's characters just always wrong? Does a good story simply require characters who make guesses, are mistaken, and are surprised by the outcome of the story they're in? That actually sounds plausible on our modern notion of a good story, maybe. But again, I think genre-based explanations will go astray. As it turns out, Hong Mai characters are wrong only when they believe, disbelieve, or doubt, in the sense of disbelieve, the words or representations of another character, whether human, divine, or demonic. But there is another sense of Yi besides doubt. In many contexts, it means simply to suspect or surmise. It means what you think upon coming to a situation. And these turn out very differently. As the table shows again, if you can find those columns on the table, looking at surmise down at the bottom, of which there are a lot of cases, by the way. When Hong's characters Yi in the sense of suspect or surmise, they stand a very good chance of being right. 44 right to 36 wrong to 32 unresolved. By the way, I'm not naturally a counter necessarily. It's just when you're looking at hundreds of cases of something, I don't know how to handle issues of how terms and concepts are used except by counting. One can't close read 200 different stories. One could indeed close read them, but then to try and summarize what they all somehow said, I think would be beyond anybody's capacities and certainly beyond mine. So I count. Second best to close reading. So what's going on here? What is the difference between between believing, disbelieving, or doubting on the one hand, and surmising or suspecting on the other? The key, I think, lies in the left-hand column of the chart, of the table, where you'll be shown what people are reacting to when they adopt these various attitudes. In the case of surmise or suspect, what they are reacting to is events or a situation. In the case of believe, disbelieve, believe and doubt, what they are reacting to is a proposition or a representation by someone in the story of what is the case. Not all representations are made with words. Sometimes one is shown something and asked to believe it. So I say proposition or representation. Propositions or representations, believing and disbelieving respond to propositions or representations. Supposing or surmising responds to events or situations. This is just how the words are used in these stories. When a character supposes or suspects, he or she is almost always responding to a situation encountered, something heard or seen or experienced, rather than to the words or representations of another character. Now, there are the exceptional cases where we're told a character suspected that so-and-so was lying to him, for instance, where actually he's it's a lengthy way of saying that he's disbelieving what the person said. In those cases, he's almost always wrong. But the rest of the time, if it was what he's reacting to is a situation, not somebody's words or representation, then he's more than half of the time right. If one were to read a moral from Hung Mai's collection as a whole, and I know how odd that is to do, and the sense in which I'm reading from a moral from it is I'm trying to see what sorts of assumptions about the meanings and uses of these words might underlie this extraordinary pattern. What sort of cultural assumptions that may indeed be unconscious or incapable of being stated by the participants. But if one were to derive a moral, a set of assumptions from the collection as a whole, it might be, what others say is inherently tricky. You're very likely to be wrong whether you believe it or disbelieve it. But if you look at a situation and figure things out for yourself, you stand a decent chance of being right. I know how implausible it seems that a whole collection of stories should have a simple moral like that, but that is the pattern of how things work out in these stories, in fact. Now notice the column headed ends in uncertainty in the table, the rightmost column. Colleagues have sometimes suggested, and here we go with genre again, that the problem with believing as an ending for a story, again, is that it is uncertain. A good story, again, it seems to me this is our own conception, should end with a definite outcome in which both characters and readers know what has happened. But this simply does not match the narrative procedures of Hung Mai or his informants, because as 37 cases in the table show, Hung Mai's anecdotes often end in uncertainty. It's perfectly common, 37 out of 215, I don't know if we want to call it permanently common, it's perfectly common, it's certainly not unusual. It is perfectly common for Hung or his informant to end with a speculation as to what has happened with no confirmation in the story itself. And I offer two examples of this on the passages handout, which are numbers 10 and 11. The first, it rains rice in Shuzhou, where he tells us at the end, people surmised that the reason it rained black rice was thus and so, and he never provides any confirmation for this or or even confirm that he thinks it's true too. The second is people in Hanyang say the python, who was killed earlier in the story, was a mountain god, but Hung Mai then proceeds to doubt that explanation and say, but if that's true, then why couldn't he do thus and so, saying sort of that explanation doesn't make sense to me, but then he simply ends the story. He just leaves us in a state of not knowing. This, I think, has to do with how Hung Mai sees his role as a compiler, in fact, and it's interesting evidence of how he sees his role as a compiler, because people have often doubted and thought that this was an assumed role or an affected role, but he presents himself as a transmitter of stories, plain and simple, from other people who gossip and tell them to him when they're drinking together or doing other things together. I think this tells us he's not trying to create good stories out of the things. He's hearing good stories that he finds either good or interesting for some other reason than the goodness of the narrative, and he's conveying them to us. And so he's perfectly happy to convey one that is utterly unresolved as far as he's concerned. So that I would say that belief and disbelief are uncertain does not explain their travails in Hung Mai's anecdotes. If it did, then ye, as suspect or suppose, an attitude of uncertainty itself, would prove wrong with similar regularity, and stories would not end unresolved 37 times in 215 anecdotes, if uncertainty were a problem. The problems that Shin presents are not the same in Hung Mai's collection as in the written judgments. There, the message judges send seems to be other people's propositions should be disbelieved, though they fudge it by locating their disbelief in the propositions themselves rather than in themselves. They say a proposition is unbelievable, not I don't believe. They're attributing it elsewhere, not to them. Hung Mai's anecdotes, on the other hand, seem to be collectively telling the reader, as I suggested before, other people's propositions are such an unreliable foundation for knowledge that whether you choose to believe or disbelieve them, you are likely to guess wrong. But these are surely, it seems to me, kindred attitudes. Judges almost entirely avoid saying, I believe, and largely avoid literally saying, I disbelieve. Hung Mai's informants attribute believing and disbelieving to their characters largely in order to show them wrong. The magistrate's judgment and a piece of occult gossip are different enough genres, representing different enough settings and roles, to suggest together that Southern Song gentlemen found propositional belief a difficult and possibly dangerous notion. This puts Wang's show's confident exhortations to believe in a series of, frankly, strange propositions in a peculiar light. But it may be that as a man of lay gentlemanly background himself, he assumes that when facing such an audience, propositional belief will be the Buddhist advocate's chief obstacle, and thus addresses it first of all. The Tang and Five Dynasties picture, as it emerges from the roughly, again, luckily, roughly 200 stories in the Taiping Guangji that deal with propositional belief, is diametrically different from Hong Mai's in one crucial way. I say luckily on the one hand because it's interesting that I end up with samples of similar size in the two cases. On the other hand, I say it because there are 7,000 stories in the Taiping Guangji. If 90% of them used the term Xin, I would have been in deep trouble when I set out to do this project. It's diametrically different from Hong Mai's in one crucial way. And you can look at table 3 in the handout of tables for how it's different. Namely, look at opposite, believe over here on the left, and look along the road to see the correct and incorrect. While in Hong Mai's anecdotes, those who believe something are wrong 80% of the time, in the Taiping Guangji, the proportions are reversed. Characters who believe a proposition that is presented or represented to them prove to be right in 41 cases and wrong in 11, right 79% of the time. Perhaps more strikingly, it is common for Taiping Guangji stories to end with a character in a state of correct belief. This happens in more than half, 51% of the stories in which correct belief occurs, and we've seen that it happens twice in Hong Mai's 215 anecdotes. This seems to me further evidence against an easy genre-based explanation of Hong Mai focusing on belief's uncertainty. Now, one might of course want to argue that generic change has taken place in the interim, that what is expected of a story involving belief and disbelief has changed from Tang to Song. It seems to me to argue that, to make a genre-based argument in that form, and to ask why the genre should change in this one single feature, switching from treating Xin as reliable to treating it as unreliable, would in the end be to ask, I think, the same question I'm asking here, a question about cultural and intellectual change that one could not really expect to be confined to a single genre, unless one truly believes that genres just change on their own for the hell of it, because people get tired of one kind of story. Then I would still want to know, why did they get tired of that in Song after 300 years of not being tired of it in Tang? But, Taiping Guangji characters, of course, do not only believe. As the table makes clear, they disbelieve much more often, in fact. A couple of examples are particularly good stories, and so I will not read them to you because they're so good, but I do give them to you as a number 12 and number 13 on the handout. One, you will see, is a story of a man who says that he can capture the moon in his sleeve. He can go up to the moon, fetch it back, and hide it in his sleeve. Oddly, he is not believed by his fellows when he says this to them, but he proves that he can do it to their satisfaction. They bow down. They don't actually say, well, we Xin, but they bow down and say, please take the light back because it's too bright. Second, a wife who appears in her dream to tell her husband that their neglect of Buddhism and their practice of Manichaeanism has been all wrong, and she's being punished for it. And at first he disbelieves her. She proves by spitting poison into his face, which when he wakes up, his face is in terrible pain and swollen, and so he knows it was real. And so he does what she says, which is to go to ask monks to pray for her because she's about to die in her new role as a snake living underneath a Buddhist pagoda. That is the story of Wu Kezhou in number 13 in the handout. Both these stories, by the way, end with self-evidence again, rather than explicitly ascribing belief to the characters. They simply end with the truth clear. Self-evidence is as acceptable an ending for these narrators as it is acceptable to Hong Mai and his informants. But in both stories, disbelieving proves wrong, and this, as the table shows, is true in the overwhelming majority of cases of explicit disbelief in the Taiping Guangji. Disbelievers are wrong in 136 cases out of 145, which is a very poor track record, or 94% of the time. In the Taiping Guangji, disbelieving is even more unreliable than believing is reliable. Now, you could look at this and say, well, here's a point in common. The unreliability of disbelief looks like a point that the Taiping Guangji shares with Hong Mai, but I have to say that in this case, it seems to me context completely transforms potential meaning. because it's one thing, as in Hongmai, for belief to be unreliable and for disbelief to be unreliable. In fact, it's strange. But how much more natural it seems, to me at least, by contrast, that anecdotes that treat belief as largely reliable should treat disbelief as largely unreliable. Whereas in Hongmai's anecdotes, it seems to be that any mental response to propositions or representations is problematic. In the Taiping Guangji anecdotes, the problem, I would say, is simply disbelief. I don't think it goes too far to say that the Taiping Guangji, insofar as it deals with belief, and remember, it's 215 stories out of 7,000 that do deal with disbelief, so that's interesting perhaps, though it's hard to know how to judge that fact, that insofar as it deals with belief, it's a pro-belief collection, as the record of the listener is anti-disbelief and anti-belief, which is a position that is hard to describe, but it seems to be its position. If one had to extract a single collective lesson from the Taiping Guangji anecdotes, I would say it would be believe what people, gods, ghosts tell you, and don't disbelieve it, which is, has the value, the nice trait of being consistent. I have not yet gathered and read all the Taiping Guangji anecdotes that contain the word yi, doubt, or supposition. My survey so far has only been of anecdotes with the word xin in them, and I can tell you that was enough fun by itself so far, because the number of times where the word Shinjo for the prefecture's name or other kinds of things that just are not about what I'm talking about here occur is very annoying. So on this issue, the Taiping Guangji chart here is not adequately comparable to the record of the listener's table. As a stopgap, I've explored only the instances of doubt or supposition that do happen also to appear within stories that deal with belief, which could be prejudicing the case somehow. One just doesn't know how. Interestingly, though, the case doesn't look prejudiced, because as the table shows, this picture looks very similar to that in Hongmai. When one doubts a proposition, one is twice as likely to be wrong as right, but when supposes or suspects in response to a situation, one has about equal chance of being right or wrong. It's not quite as good a chance as in Hongmai, but again, this is a very small sample of the cases. Further research will have to fill out this comparison, but frankly, as soon as I saw this, I became less interested in that set of facts, because the fact that supposition or surmise is reasonably likely to be right looks less striking here, where belief is likely to be right too, than it looks in Hongmai. I mean, you could generalize by saying when characters think something, they're likely to be right in the Taiping Guangji. And that's much less interesting to me that in Hongmai, when they think something in the form of surmising or suspecting it, they're likely to be right. But when they think it in the form of believing it, they're likely or disbelieving it. I still can't get my head around that quite. They're likely to be wrong. More interesting is another piece of context for the treatment of belief and disbelief, another possible meaning of xin. Now, a starting point for me here in this project was that because Wang Zhixiu was really talking about propositional belief, and because other senses of belief or other senses of xin are a conceptual can of worms in many ways, I, at the start, was careful to exclude anecdotes in which xin was not clearly propositional. We've already seen and you could refer to table 4 here in the tables, by the way, which I will allude to presently. We've already seen the disparity between Wang Zhixiu's xin as propositional belief and the Dasheng Qixin Lun author's xin as something like faith. A significant minority of the anecdotes in the Taiping Guangji in which xin is a verb, is clearly a verb, seem to be talking about a sort of xin that looks like more general commitment to a religious way, often Buddhism, but sometimes simply gods and ghosts. More like a religious way, like commitment to a religious way than like belief in any particular proposition, or at least these other anecdotes don't specify any propositions that the believer may be committed to. And I should be clear. I've found some anecdotes where it just says the person believes in Buddhism, and you read the rest of the anecdote, and then what it means to believe in Buddhism is being unpacked in that anecdote in terms of certain propositions that the person believes or doesn't believe. And those I put into my basket with my propositional belief stories. When there is no such unpacking, or when the belief in Buddhism is unpacked only in terms of practice, then I left it out. But then I came back to them all at the end, because they were, interestingly, not a small number. Since the distinction between belief in propositions and commitment to a practice or way of life has been the focus of a good deal of work in the study of religions, let's take on the China side James Watson's work on orthopraxy versus orthodoxy, not on the China side, Wilfred Cantwell Smith's work arguing that belief originally in Christianity meant commitment rather than meaning propositional assent. Talal Asad, whose argument I think is that propositional belief is mainly a Christian and especially modern Christian or Protestant invention and is not applicable to other religions at all, where something more like commitment and whole participation in practice is the thing. Given all of this kind of work, I thought it important to distinguish between the two and not lump them together at the start. Now, obviously, when an anecdote tells us that a character believed in the Buddha and little more, when it says shinfo and little more, I don't want even to read it as believed in the Buddha because I don't know exactly what it means. One cannot be sure that this does not imply assent to any particular Buddhist propositions. But we spent so long assuming that being a Buddhist did imply assent to particular propositions like the Four Noble Truths and so on, then have learned that that's not necessarily the case. So I think it's just fine if we don't assume it when we see Shinfo. One can't be sure that he doesn't assent to some propositions, but I've exercised methodological caution in the other direction. If the anecdote does not unpack the belief in Buddhism, as I said, in terms of propositions, then I've counted it as at least potentially non-propositional and excluded it from my counts and tabling in tables 1 to 3 in this paper. Yet, in the Taiping Guangji, interestingly enough, such anecdotes pretty often go on to narrate events that are clearly meant by the storyteller, by the narrator, either to justify the character's belief in, the character's faith, the character's commitment, whatever this may be, to show it, despite its apparent non-propositionality, as right, if I can use that term, or to do the opposite, to show it unjustified or misfounded. 3 such anecdotes appear in the handout as numbers 14, 15, and 16, and those are the ones also that I have tabled in Table 4 on the tables handout. So in 14, 15, and 16, we have stories of things like a man who believes profoundly in the great Dharma, and he deposits the sutra in a monastery, and then the monastery catches fire, and only the sutra that he deposited, it doesn't burn, among everything else in the monastery. And so his friends, who when he died had already suspected that he had attained the way. There's an interesting case of true surmise or suspicion, by the way. When they heard about this sutra, they were astonished all the more. In other words, this is showing that he really had the goods, that there was something about his dushin that was particularly effective, particularly, again, I resist using the word right, but I will say right. In number 15, we have somebody who had long not believed in the Buddha Dharma, and when his wife reads sutras, he says, "Why are you seduced by a Hunnish god into reading those books?" But when he saw this other case of Dongxiong that we're told about earlier in the anecdote, he deeply realized his fault in not believing and now knew that the Buddha was a great sage. I think both his original challenge and his conclusion, what he knows at the end, could suggest that actually the issue was not, why are you seduced by a Hunnish god, even suggests he may think the Buddha exists. The point is not that the Buddha, it is not about the proposition whether the Buddha exists or not. This is about that the Buddha is a Hunnish god. The Buddha perhaps is a god, but is Hunnish, and has seduced his wife into reading these books. That sounds kind of like a real thing almost. So that he does not believe that the Buddha exists, I don't think is the issue in this story. And at the end, it doesn't say, and now he deeply believed that there was, Fo, or that the Buddha would do such and such. He believed now that the Buddha was a great sage. So he's gone from believing that the Buddha was a Hunnish god to believing that the Buddha is a great sage, if you want to state it in terms of propositions. But what I think he's really gone from is commitment, non-commitment to the Buddha Dharma, to commitment to the Buddha Dharma. I think that's what that story is about. And if we look at the last one, we get another animal killing one, number 16. He has a dream which reveals to him that he should not have been killing animals, essentially. And after he's had this dream, although he did not believe in the Buddha before, his profound belief now exceeds that of others. So, Table 4 shows, and it's in a way a trivial finding because who really would have expected something different of this kind of story? But it's interesting to me for another reason. In Table 4 we see that whatever this shin is, that's commitment, faith, belief in, and whatever this bushin is, that's non-commitment, unfaith, disbelief in. They work out this pretty much the same as Xin, propositional Xin works out in the Taiping Guangji, even more so actually. That is to say, believing in Xin is almost always right, and disbelieving in is almost always wrong. So what's interesting is that although I rigorously tried to distinguish the two in the Taiping Guangji, I found myself wondering by the end, well, but are they really rigorously distinguishing these two? I mean, even though that's perfectly clear in some cases they're talking about propositions, is for both of them commitment, religious commitment or commitment to supernatural things, is it in some sense the same, or is there more overlap or more blurriness about them than in the Tang than in the Song? Commitment to a religious way of life, just like commitment to a proposition, is likely to turn out well. Non-commitment is not. That is the message, if there is a message, of the Taiping Guangji stories on belief. Now, many of these anecdotes of non-propositional belief, as you've seen here, have a specifically Buddhist slant and/or come from collections with a generally Buddhist orientation, and these include some of the earliest collections included in the Taiping Guangji. And I have to say, there's a piece of this work I haven't done yet and could do fairly quickly, but I've been working on a schedule. In a few days, I could find out the distribution of dates for different kinds of these different kinds of belief in the collection. I strongly suspect right now that it will turn out that successful non-propositional belief has a much earlier average date in the Taiping Guangji than successful clearly propositional belief, but it remains to be seen. I don't think, though, that it goes too far to suggest that the preference for belief that the Taiping Guangji shows in the propositional sphere has been influenced by a generally positive cultural attitude toward religious and especially Buddhist commitment that goes back to early Tang and well beyond, and that is directly represented by these anecdotes of believing in. And I hate to say a thing like, Tang was Buddhist and the Song wasn't, because I don't actually think that's what explains this, but it's very interesting. It is striking, then, that Hong Mai's anecdotes, the ones I've explored, include only 5 or 6 that declare a character's non-propositional belief in this same way. That just start by saying that somebody's Xinfo or Xinfo-fa or Xinfa or something like that, Xindafa or something like that. That's quite unusual, 5 or 6 of the 215. I haven't even tabled them because I wasn't counting them back then, and I could go back and see, but who cares how 5 or 6 anecdotes break down, really? It's such a small sample. The point is, he's not paying as much attention to that kind of thing. Now, in the story of change that I'm proposing to tell, one Southern Song compiler is being made to carry a lot of weight. Some of you know I've done previous work on Hong Mai. I have become a firm believer that Hong Mai is not only truly a compiler and truly a transmitter, but he's actually a quite faithful compiler, I think, a quite faithful transmitter. I think one can show this from the evidence of other sources. Things come through in these anecdotes that are known to be true from other sources that he would have no way of knowing except from having been told the anecdote. So when he says, if he's too drunk when he hears the anecdote that he doesn't really remember it that clearly, he goes back and asks the person to tell it again. I've come to believe that he's actually describing his procedure, that he's almost an ethnographer of these kinds of things, except that he's not an ethnographer because he doesn't see them as folk belief, he sees them as real. So we're asking him to bear a lot of weight, but I think he may be able to bear it. I mean, I think in compiling 4,000 or so stories, he may have essayed a pretty good sample of what Southern Song elites were talking about to each other when they were drunk and when they were telling each other interesting stories, interesting occult stories. It would be wise, nonetheless, to consult other Southern Song material before concluding too surely based on Hong Mai alone, and there is a fair abundance of other Southern Song occult anecdote material, so that won't be hard to do. But if the patterns from the Taiping Guangji and Record of the Listener represent real change between Tang and Southern Song elite views in how elite viewed belief, it would be good to know when the change happened. Obviously, the first thing that anybody would think, is first thing I thought, is late Tang or 5 dynasties, because the 9th and 10th centuries are rich in political and cultural innovations that the Song inherited. In some ways, it's not wrong to think of the late Tang and 5 dynasties as the beginning of the Song, or as getting the Song done before the Song was there. There are many respects. I know, Nick, that's not the case in your area, but it is the case in some areas of cultural change. In this case, however, the evidence says pretty roundly no. To find anticipations of Hong Mai's patterns, the crucial category is obviously the Taiping Guangji anecdotes that show belief as false. So I did go to those and find out their mean date based on the collection they came from, and went to all the ones that find belief as true. Luckily, it was a small enough number that it was fairly easy to do this. And the fact is, okay, grab onto this if you want to. The mean date of Taiping Guangji anecdotes that show correct belief is 848. The mean date of the much smaller number of anecdotes that show incorrect belief is 860. You might say it looks like a difference in the right direction to anticipate Hong Mai, though it's pretty small, 12-year difference in average date. When I saw it, I think I know exactly what's causing that, and it's a sampling issue. But if one examines specifically the anecdotes that originate in the 10th century, that is, if one looks at the anecdotes that ought to be influencing that mean toward 860 instead of toward, if this is changing toward the Song, then it ought to be in the 10th century that one finds the change starting to happen. So they ought to be what's pulling up the mean. And if you look at them and just look and say how many of the 960 to 965, because that's when my sample stops, because the Song is already there, and that's when the Taiping Guangji starts as far as anecdotes using Xin are concerned. If you look at those, there are 11 anecdotes from 900 to 965, and one of those 11 is a story of false belief. I'm sorry, that's completely wrong. I just said something false. That was a false belief. Only one of the 11 false belief anecdotes that there are in all of the Taiping Guangji comes from the 10th century, comes from 900 to 965, whereas 7 of the 38 correct belief anecdotes come from 900 to 965. So it just won't fly. If we think this change is supposed to be happening and showing its traces in the Taiping Guangji, it's not happening in the 10th century. If you want to say 860 versus 848 means it was happening in the 880s and 890s, but then it paused in the 10th century, go ahead and say it. I think if I look at it, I'll find that's not right. But in any case, you can look at the 10th century, it's not happening in those stories. The 10th century shows no tendency at all to move toward Hong Mai's view of belief. This is disappointing in one way, because it means that what I said at the start, that maybe the whole thing happens in the Song, this may be the case. And I was sort of this is prepared originally for a workshop that's going to happen later on the Tang-Song transition. I was hoping for a Tang-Song transition phenomenon. I think now I have a Tang-Song difference where the transition is entirely within the Song, but assuming it's all true. Now, how much time have I used? Too much. I'm not sure when we started, though. Anybody know when we started? I have some wild speculations about the origins of the Song problem with belief, and if you coax me in the Q&A, I might try to articulate them, but instead I'll end with, where do I go from here? I've pointed toward non-Hong Mai anecdotes in Southern Song as one direction. Another is the gaping hole in Northern Song. Another thing I very much want to do is explore how do we get from the kind of Xin that we find in The Awakening of Faith, if you pardon me for using the translation title, to Wang Erxiu's version. For all I know, this is something that 5 dynasties and Tang Buddhists are already doing, and I haven't explored and found that out. They are already concentrating on propositional belief. I would not be surprised now to find out that that's not the case, but one doesn't know. So I want to look at those. I also have this slightly crazy idea. In reading the legal judgments and finding that judges often seem to treat doubt as a positive step, something that they can acknowledge in themselves as a movement toward what they don't call Xin, but as a movement towards certainty of judgment at the end, I found myself reminded of Miriam Levering's work, and I think there's been other work, on the importance of doubt as essentially a positive step in a Chan process in the Song. And it's always been interesting and puzzling that Chan calls its cases Gong'an, right? Legal judgments, which is not the most common word for a legal judgment, a legal case in the Song, incidentally, but it is a term that is used in the collection of legal judgments as one word for a legal case. So I wondered if there really is a connection here, if there was something that Chan people were aware that judges went through these kinds of doubt to certainty processes, and that's one of the reasons they called Koan Gong'an, for instance. I don't know, but it's something I'm interested in looking at. But for now, I've managed to persuade myself that the change I've found is probably real, and I hope I've given you some reason, at least, to wonder if it is. I think that something strange happened to belief from the Tang to the Song. That's all. Thanks. I'm sorry, unless I'm wrong about when I started, I went on longer than I did when I practiced this. So too many side remarks, but sorry for trying your patience, if I did.
Questions?
Sorry, question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. As another example of a Southern Song phenomenon, I was wondering what you thought of some of the material in Zhuxi's, or the collection of Zhuxi conversations in Zhuxi Lake.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of this, he has this story where he says that, I guess there's this common belief that lizards are somehow responsible for hail. And he says that this was told to him by this old man who lived in a mountain who saw this happen. And he says, that person wouldn't fool me, he's a reliable guy. And so there's this character for Zhuxi who is
Yeah.
the reliable dude.
Yeah.
And I wonder.
And what's the word for reliable? Is it shin?
So he says that this person is. I think he says he. 不欺, and then he also says that he's 缺 or something like that. The 城市的缺, this is the 缺.
Actually, I should have. Yeah, go ahead.
And so I have no way of knowing whether this is representative of anything, but it seems like it's an interesting thing that there are people walking around who, even spouting out complete nonsense would somehow be reliable. And I don't know how that fits into the bigger story.
And Jushi may be have been a very good judge of character, and the issue would have been this guy believed what he was saying, and wasn't somebody who would deceive Jushi. In fact, they could both be right. In that, I mean, both things could be true: that the guy was reliable and that he was wrong, or that we think he was wrong. Because I don't believe that hail. This comes from lizards, but yeah. I'm actually interested in the Yulei. It's a source I didn't mention. If one is looking. I mean, really, if the thing is to put Hong Mai into a social and cultural context, the Yulei is another place one has to look. If you look for big bodies of Southern Song source material from people who lived around the same time as Hong Mai, then Jushi is really important. And I do intend to get around to the Yulei at some point. One reason I haven't gotten around to it early in the project is that my own suspicion is that there's not going to be a lot of shin in the Yulei, and that when there is shin, it's going to be, reliability, trustworthiness, trust, the Confucian virtue of shin that obtains between friends, and so on. However, I said I was willing to make some wild speculations, so maybe I will, because shin as trustworthiness and trust, and as the virtue that obtains between friends, is something I've been wondering about. And at the risk of throwing up a red flag for you, I will tell you that Hong Mai has a little tiny piece about Xin as trust. Xin specifically, in fact, the title of the piece is Peng You Zhi Yi, the virtue or the duty or the rightness or righteousness of friendship. And it's very short, but he really says a mouthful in it, because what he essentially says is this is the prime. Xin is the prime virtue of friendship, the prime backbone of friendship. He doesn't use that metaphor, and he says you can see this in the Zhongyong, you can see it in the Mencius, you can see it in the Analects, you can see it. He cites classical texts that you can see the importance of. And then he says, and from the Han through the Tang, there were lots of famous examples of good friends who built them, their relationships on Xin. And he mentions a few famous ones. And then he says, in the first 100 years of this dynasty, we had that too, but now it's gone. So what he's saying, I think, is fairly clearly, I mean, on the one hand, on the surface level, he means there are no more good friendships since the first 100 years of the dynasty. There's not a board here, is there? I was about to draw on a piece of art with no piece of chalk. If a Southern Song man says the first 100 years of the Song to me, he means only, and that something bad happened after that. He means only one thing. I mean, if you count from 960, 100 years is 1060. If you count from 976, 100 years is 976. Guess what comes smack between those two dates? 1067, when Wang Anshi came to power. He's talking about either Wang Anshi or about the factional conflict between Wang Anshi and Sima Guang that ruined friendship by ruining Xin. It ruined trust. Now, Xin as trust is another thing that when I started this project, I was determined to say, I'm not doing that because it's a can of worms, and because it's huge, it's limitless. And I thought Anna Shields had done a very good job of handling it in her book on Tang, Writings About Friendship. And in fact, it was Anna Shields' book that reminded me of this passage, which I'd noticed before some years ago in Hong Mai. But I think it's something one can't look away from. For a famous Southern Song man to say that what we lack since 1067 in our dynasty is Xin, in the sense of trustworthiness and trust, and the kind of thing that binds human relations of equality together. And then we find the same man is presenting a collection of occult stories, which he has not made up, which he has in fact gathered from his fellows, to the number of 4,000 stories over 43 years or something like that. I have to wonder, is there a connection here? So one of the wild speculations I would engage in is that actually a breakdown of belief in belief among literati in the Song comes from a breakdown in Xin, in trustworthiness, or at least a breakdown in the belief in trustworthiness and trust, and that these two things sort of go together for them. Something that has fed into this in a weird way, Nick, has been your work, because I've come to think of the Song elite in a whole new way, I think, because of your work, in this sense that you've really persuaded me that the destruction of the Tang aristocracy was something like a genocide, that there was something like a biological extirpation, a demographic extirpation of a very large proportion of a social class. What that says to me is that the next people who came on the scene and had the chance to be elites and act out the whole office holding and exam taking thing were really doing it in a kind of vacuum. A vacuum of people who had done this before, had experience with it, knew how to do it. And one thing about your Tang elite that's very striking is how if you read Anna Shields' book, you'll find that one of the things that supports Xin in friendship is sameness. People are supposed to be the same in order to be friends. And I kind of assume that the model for relations of equals in Song, aside from true friendship, was also the model of friend. You know, and things like the Neo-Confucian network, I think they were thinking of themselves as modeling themselves on friends. I think Ouyang Xiu, when he writes about factions, is talking about men who make friends with each other and who are also the virtuous ones and who recognize each other by their sameness. It seems to me that the Tang aristocracy was incredibly same, as it were. They had a lot of sameness to fall back on. They were mostly living or in the same place. They were mostly of the same kind of descent. They were involved in the same marriage circles. And the Song elite tries to reproduce that, but it doesn't. Right from the start, it doesn't really succeed in reproducing the geographical sameness. It does some of the reproducing of the marriage sameness. It doesn't have any kind of sameness of descent. And probably for the first time in a long time, I think, you had people speaking different dialects of Chinese coming to the capital and to serve in office together in the Song. Because these really are guys coming up from the boonies and suddenly finding themselves able to hold central office, as you show they had not been able to do in the Tang. So I just wonder, isn't there a real problem sort of setting up an elite and having an elite come to believe that it is the same thing? Because I think Chinese elites needed to believe they were the same thing. In order to make the relationships among themselves, they needed that sense of sameness. And my wild speculation is that that effort defeated the Song elite. And it defeated it around the time of the factional struggles of Wang Anshi and Sima Guang. That's the sign of the defeat of trying to form a unified elite out of bits and pieces of local stuff. And you know, that I believe that they then descended into sort of local elites who were still aware of their engagement with each other across wide spans, but were not trying to live life in the same place in the same way with the same spoken language, I don't think, anymore. So I wonder if that's the point at which Xin breaks down in the sense of trust and trustworthiness, in their minds, and if that's also the point at which Shin, in the sense of belief in something, starts to become unreliable in their minds. The problem about trying to find this out is there's not nearly as much occult anecdote material for the Northern Song as there is for the Southern Song, which is an interesting and surprising fact. There isn't really an equivalent for typing Guangji of Northern Song material. We have a real gap. So one has to get at the issue of Shin and how it's viewed in the belief sense in a different way, probably. And that may be a tough call, a tough job. But anyway, that's my wild speculation about Shin. Yes. Oh, Paula, sorry. Then we'll come back to.
So
sure.
For the Northern Song, why isn't Sudongpo's Zhilin, is that a helpful source, or is that he has this collection of ghost stories and crazy stories?
Yeah, no, I mean, and there are a few such things. It's just that they aren't going to be there in the kind of abundance that we have from Southern Song, which makes a difference, because even in Hongmai, stories that talk about Shin as belief are only about 8 to 10% of the total so far, which doesn't mean he's not concerned with it in other stories, actually, because there are a lot of ways for a character to find out, for us to be indicated to us that a character is thinking in a certain way and then, or is expecting a certain thing and then something else that comes along. I mean, there's the word ran, there's the word guo. I've talked about some of these things in other work, but since I was interested specifically in Shin, that's what I went looking for. And my guess is you need a lot of stories before you get a decent sample of stories that talk about Shin. But that's, obviously I want to try and do that kind of thing. Paula?
Yeah, I think this is just a fascinating subject, and it's very exciting. And I hate to do this because you raised several times the question of genre and kind of pushed it away. And
no, everybody literary does this. I don't blame you.
But it isn't. But my interest in that question doesn't have to do really with the question of convention, because I think that's what you're associating.
Yeah, that's what I'm associating with genre there. You're right.
I'm actually not thinking about that. Rather,
Swell.
I'm thinking about the practice, the editorial practice of collecting these stories, and the history of those collections has everything to do with keeping a record of the things that don't make it into the shur. That these have been referred to almost since the beginning as yishu.
Yes, yeah.
And so in that framing of the entire corpus, the question of belief is absolutely core to the very existence of all of these texts. That is why they exist, and that's why they were brought together in this way. So, so one thing that I was wondering that could shed a little bit of light on this question from that perspective is looking at prefatory material or any kind of paratextual material that tries in explicit ways to justify what the essence of thinking something to be true, since that is the worry here, right? And you opened the talk with that mention of just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean you shouldn't believe it. Right. So seeing and believing are not really, that's not the necessary criterion. So I'm wondering if that would also help, if comparing paratextual material for the collections that you're looking at would help answer some of the questions about this.
It might well, and in the future I certainly intend to do it. What I've Hongmai's paratextual material, his prefaces are something I've looked at a lot and worked on a lot in a couple of different articles, but he's became famous for having written a different preface for each installment of his collection, 43 prefaces or something like that. Now granted, he had 40 years to do it in, but people were still very impressed by this. And it seems to me clear that the message of his prefaces combined with the message of his other writings is he's presenting material that he considers what I've called them as candidates for truth, but we could also say candidates for belief. He's got no sense of fictionality at all. If somebody has given him a story that he can show is wrong, he considers them essentially to have deceived him or tricked him. It's not. I don't know if he has a sense of a good story, actually. I don't think he's that kind of guy. But he thinks he's gathering knowledge. And and my impression from reading, especially Rob Campany, who's worked on a number of pre-Song collections, although mostly Six Dynasties one, is that Campany thinks, I mean, since I haven't read the prefaces myself, I will say, Campany thinks that what they're saying about what they're doing is rather similar, that they are presenting also candidates for truth or candidates for belief. Nobody who does this kind of work would guarantee, you know, everything I've written down here really happened, but what they say is this is the kind of thing that happens that we ought to be more aware of than we are, or something like that. So I kind of tend to think of there as being a kind of continuity, and I will say generic continuity across time in this stuff. And I'm by no means saying I shouldn't therefore look at Tang prefaces to Tang collections, which I certainly should, because they might be very illuminating. But my impression has been of a kind of continuity. And in one of Hong Mai's prefaces, which I cite in a footnote of this, but obviously I didn't read the footnotes, he says, he tries to distinguish his own work from what has come before, but in doing so, I thought it's like a little ball had fallen from the sky. In doing so, oh damn, well, you know, Hymes came and destroyed our equipment. In doing so, what he does is actually say show us who he thinks his predecessors are. And he gives us a list of 5, and one is Ganbao, of course. I mean, he talks about Zhuangzi, and he talks about Qixia, the mythical gatherer of Zhiguai, and Zhuangzi, but he sets them aside, actually. In fact, he sort of pushes them away. And then he moves on to people he's treating as real predecessors, who are Ganbao and you know, the Shoushunji. And then either 4 or 5, I may be misremembering, Tang collections, which are all collections that are in the Taiping Guangji and are all collections that have gone into actually these tables. I was very pleased when I went back and saw this, because I didn't know a lot about the collections in the Taiping Guangji before I was doing this work, frankly. So when I saw these suddenly familiar names of collections in Hong Mai's preface, where I'd seen them before, but without their registering in any way, I thought, well, that's good. That suggests that Hong Mai too thought there was generic continuity across time here. So what I'm really suggesting is that, well, as I said before, if there was change of genre, these guys didn't know that the change of genre was happening. And I would say I don't think Hong Mai necessarily knew that the stories in his collection all said that belief was bad and disbelief was bad. I don't think that was something that was necessarily a conscious thing. But yes, I should look at preface to see if because maybe they explain it. Maybe they explain why they're playing up belief, for instance. Go ahead, yeah, follow?
I'm just scratching.
I wouldn't necessarily expect to find very explicit explanations along those lines, but perhaps some very interesting uses of terminology that kind of cluster around notions of belief, especially because the purpose of this shoot, of course, is to say, well, between you and me, like, okay, we'll put these are things that I got, but here's the truth about them. So there's so many layers of propositional belief, if you will, that some very close reading of those texts could maybe reveal some of those things.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, this is a kind of step that I've needed to take from the beginning. I've been treating Taiping Guangji as a proxy for Tang occult anecdotes, but the Tang occult anecdotes, in fact, occur in separate collections, and one can go to some of those collections and to the great, compendium of Tao Min, who reconstructed some of them from the Taiping Guangji, and arranged them back into their proper collections and so on. And that's something I have to look at. And indeed, it's something that potentially could undermine the case that I'm making here for change if, for instance, it turned out that, and I'm reasonably sure this is not true just from my own reading of the stories, if it turned out that all the positive belief was in fact in collections that were heavily Buddhist-oriented, and Hong Mai's not heavily Buddhist-oriented, then, well, one would say, well, look for the collections in the Song that are heavily Buddhist-oriented, and then you haven't got to change anymore. I don't think that's going to be the case because, as I say, I've read enough of them to think no, but it could certainly change the numbers, for instance. But yeah, I need to be reading the prefaces.
Yeah,
David.
I'm sorry to harp on genre, but
No, it's fine.
There is, these that you're talking about, there's pretty subtle problems, at stake. But Qingming Qi versus Hong Mai, there you have really different,
Yes.
different things are being done with,
Yes.
with the text. right?
Yes.
And there, I think it is kind of problematic to take the word, as it exists in these two very different contexts, and try to somehow put them together.
I mean, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. I don't know. I mean, my hope when I started the project was to look at Shin across the religious secular divide, if one wants to. Not that Hongmai is quite a religious text, but across the supernatural, non-supernatural divide, or something like that. To put it in rough terms. And yes, no, I think they're very, very different kind of texts. On the other hand, my spinning of that would be different than yours, which is that if this discomfort with this term, with this notion, seems to come from two such different kinds of texts, well, then one really does have to come up with a good individual explanation from each text. I mean, one could kick. Yeah, one needs to. We need to kick out the Qingmingji for reasons, not just because it's different. We need to say, okay, here's what's going on. This is why the judges never say Shin. And none of the explanations I tried out, it seems to me, work, but that doesn't mean there might not be, there aren't others.
So are you proposing a kind of infection of the word?
I guess I kind of am at this point. Maybe just a kind of discomfort, but discomfort with the word, that it,
that makes somebody, whereas doubt.
Whereas doubt is very
is
smart, right?
Absolutely rooted in the sort of thisness of, the suchness of things, right? And
Yes.
Doubting something,
Yep.
by definition, it's kind of the thing itself.
Yeah.
Whereas Shin maybe has, according to you, has gotten
A bad name.
bad aura.
That's what I'm kind of thinking. It's
How does
really,
something like that happen?
it's really fuzzier than I like things to be.
No, how
But
does something like that happen, though? How does a word?
well, it might be,
The concepts
yeah.
that are
it-
marked by the word become sort of something to avoid. There must be something really big going on, if that's the case, that has to do with this series of meanings of Xin.
Well, I mean, one of the ways that I'm trying to account for it is by shifting it over to the other meaning of Shin and talking about. I don't think there's any difficulty in at least imagining how people who went through the factional struggles of the late Northern Song and the loss of North China would have found themselves disappointed again and again and again and again and again in people they had trusted. Found relationships torn apart again and again and again that they had put trust into. So it seems to me perfectly clear how trust, I mean, and Hongmai says, we ain't got trust anymore, and I don't think we should just, laugh that off necessarily. He doesn't just say, like in the good old days. If he had just said in Han, in classical times and Han, they had trust, and we don't have that anymore. To me, that's just a classic, yeah, sure, things were better once. But he says, the first 100 years of our dynasty, we had it, and then we stopped. And I think that's talking about the problems of late Northern Song and early Southern Song. So if there could be an infection, I guess I am talking about a kind of conceptual infection from Shin as trust of other people, and Shin as trustworthiness that you rely upon, reliability of other people. Well, doesn't that translate in a pretty natural way into you don't believe what they say either? What's weird about it is that you also don't disbelieve what they say. But
Telescoping those two meanings of
Yeah.
Xin
no, I know,
is a real issue.
Well, that's interesting that you say that, because other people have told me you're making a false distinction in the first place. There's no distinction between Shin as trust and Shin as belief. They're just the same.
No.
They're just the same thing. I don't think that's right,
I
but
don't think it's right either.
yes, please.
But then you create some questions for you.
Yes. Go ahead.
It's very interesting topic, seen actually across all Chinese culture from ancient time to modern time. But it's a good view from Xin story to examine Tang and Song society. And Xin about the relationship between people and God. So among the different religions like Buddhism, Taoism, or like even shamanism, all the religions. And I think two facts. One fact is about God and another about underneath, that is ghost. So,
mhm.
yeah, another thing about, Chinese, actually for the ordinary people in Tang and Song Dynasty, most of them believe means we call 鬼神信仰, means 鬼 is the first and then God, means ghost and God belief. So I think about like God and they connected actually. So if you read all the sutras, like some sutra really, connected with the 太平广记. Some stories, if you track back, you can find.
Oh, certainly, certainly. And in
Yeah.
Hongmai too, there are stories
Yeah.
that may not be from sutras exactly, but they are drawn
Yeah.
straight out of Buddhist mythology. My colleague Zhao Huayang has just been showing this in some work of his with Hongmai stories. That connection is very much there.
Yeah, like the sutra, like Yulan Penjing, we call it Yulan.
Yep.
Yeah, Yulan Sutra. Yeah, this sutra from Indian, but is really well believed in China, in Tang and Song Dynasty, because we have like 13 Buddhist texts still discovered in Dunhuang Buddhist cave, so still there. And this about this, developed, this sutra developed to a story about Mu Lian.
Yes, no question.
Mu Lian.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this story.
You're sitting behind somebody who knows a lot about that.
This story is widespread all across
Yeah.
Tang and Song Dynasty.
Yeah, yeah.
So related about, Buddha and also the higher
Yeah.
of the ghost. So that's here, and my thinking is when you do the project, you do the research, one side is about seeing between people, right? So can you, would you also means track some Dunhuang, documents, because between the gentlemen, between the scholars, their writers, they write a letter.
And we have a lot of letters from the Song outside of Dunhuang too, yeah. Yeah.
Because all the letters, from all the letters you will figure out. So all the on the top of scholars, means top class people, how they, contact each other in the different situations.
Yeah.
For the means working labor, farmers, for the different level of people, right? It's very interesting because the Chinese scholar already published their book. Okay, sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you. These are very interesting remarks. I would in the Yulan Panjing. My impression is that in the Song, it's beginning to be crowded out to some extent by, I'm going to forget the Chinese name of it, but the Sutra of the Burning Mouth Hungry Ghost, which is associated with a ritual for similar purposes. I think you've named a large number of things that I should be looking at and thinking about, and thank you for that. It's a potentially very big project in the long run. And I don't know as much about Buddhism as I would like to. I hope to know more by the end of it. Yes?
I think the contrast of epistemic culture you have presented between Tang and Song is very amazing, and I'm thinking ways to press it further. So one thing that strikes me immediately with regard to the text you presented is the narrative structure. So if you started with someone not believing something, then very likely that the story goes that he later believes that. That makes it interesting. And if you started with someone holding a belief, then that is implying maybe later this is challenged, later is disproved, or later is also kind of differentiate himself from that. So I'm saying this can be, strengthening your argument in a certain way that why in the type in Guangji they favor a narrative structure starting with disbelieving, then showing, well, the right thing is to believe. While in the Jianzhi version, people started to believe, but also trying to show the that is
Yeah, I'll tell you a secret though. Here's the problem. You will see that in the Taiping Guangji 2, it is relatively unusual for a story, for a character who's, and I have not got these tabled according to when in the story something happens. So there are actually different parts of the story, being jumbled together here, in fact. But you do not find cases where a character bu xin and the story ends with xin, except for 3 times. It's actually much more common for the story to end with xin when somebody starts out believing, or where somebody is gradually brought to xin. It happens a lot in Taiping Guangji stories, actually, and this would be very unusual in a Hong Mai story, that somebody reaches belief midway through the story, and then at the end of the story they're still believing. It seems to me that sometimes Taiping Guangji stories have less dramatic structure, actually, than Hong Mai stories, except then there are the Hong Mai stories that have no ending. So, that's also a big exception. But what you said, that it is interesting and exciting for somebody to begin believing something and then end disbelieving it, or for them to begin disbelieving it and end believing it, is not only what I thought at the beginning of this project, but something I actually made the mistake of putting into print in another past article about Hong Mai, in which I wrote this sentence. I may quote it in a footnote here. I think I do. In any case, I can more or less remember it because it became embarrassing. I wrote a sentence that went, xin is one of the complex of terms like ran and guo and so on that plays a part in the articulating of worries about truth in Hong Mai stories. This is what that article was about. And I say at some point, so it very often happens that a character disbelieves what he hears from a ghost. He bu xin what he hears, and then at the end of the story he xin. And that was a lie, I actually realized after the fact. I mean, it wasn't quite a lie because it wasn't intentional, but what happened there was I'd read so many Hong Mai stories where somebody disbelieved at the beginning, and then at the end it was perfectly clear what happened, so that probably the main character, if one were there, one would probably find the main character believed, and the narrator believed, and the reader believed, and everybody else, but nobody was being said to xin. It just, so that whole structure that I was describing, where somebody bu xin in the first place and xin at the end, it just doesn't happen. It turns out there's not a single case of that, and there are a couple of cases where they do clearly disbelieve, but he doesn't call it bu xin early, and then they end up xin at the end. As it turns out, it's also a rather unusual structure in the Taiping Guangji. So the thing that we think of as the natural, wonderful structure for a story is not what they're articulating with the literal words. This is why I make such a big point of how stories end in self-evidence. I didn't know what to call that category, except, you're going along, somebody didn't believe something, and then by God, it turned out to be the case that the other thing was true. And sometimes that's articulated with words, but it's usually articulated as guo, or ran, or buran, then they came to the end and it was buran, but he doesn't say that anybody xin or bu xin. It just, so in terms of those words, that structure doesn't exist. In terms of narratives, it exists to some degree, but not nearly as dominantly as we would imagine. And I would give the stories that just end conclusively as a perfect example. We don't expect that from a ghost story, I think. Or maybe we do. Maybe they're sitting around a fire and then nobody knew ever again whether that was a ghost or not. I don't know. Maybe there are. Maybe that makes it more authentic. But the point is, a lot of what I expected about what was a logical story structure in either of these collections just turned out to be not the structures that they were using. And I suppose it would be good research at some date in the future. I hope to get myself out of the mire of Hong Mai, actually, but I suppose it would be good research for somebody else to do, to really, do serious analysis of the range of story structures and the type of story structures that are in Hong Mai, and perhaps see how that interacts with my kind of data, or perhaps forget my data and just do it for its own sake, and to do the same thing with the Taiping Guangji, but I'm not doing that work, and I think I'm confident in saying I'm not going to do that work, because it's then you're talking about that's a massive undertaking. That should be done by a group of people with computers and not by a scholar with a computer, but not a programmer. This just keeps falling off. I actually believe that there is a ghost. Other questions? Yes?
I'm just very intrigued about the possibility that you brought up about the difference being a result partly of the rise of Chan and koans, because those kind of anecdotes often don't end in certainty at all.
No, absolutely not.
And also, you mentioned a few times about how it's not a direct correlation between not believing or believing, and perhaps it's more the purpose is actually to bring up a kind of uncertainty rather than, one that actually the uncertainty is actually more intriguing and more believable than saying it's someone believed it or someone didn't or something like that.
Well, yes, but and I'm pretty sure these data are good because it's something I've been pretty careful about. I was struck by how many stories ended with uncertainty because I didn't expect any to. You have 37 of 215, I guess, in the case of the record of the listener. I have it written as 34 here. I remember it as 37. Maybe it is 34. In any case, so that's a significant proportion. That's 15%. But on the other hand, that means 85% ended with what I considered in reading the story to be certainty. It just wasn't certainty that was articulated by, and now this guy believed it. Sometimes it's articulated by, and now this guy knew it. Sometimes it just, and there the God was, behold. Guaran, and it was indeed so. There's that kind of certainty. Lots of stories end up in certainty without using any of the magic words. When you read them, you'll see what if you read them, you'll see what I mean. So if one wants to say, well, uncertainty makes the story more interesting, and so actually uncertainty is a more natural thing for them to be doing, then one just has to bear in mind, in the case of Hong Mai, they're only doing it 15% of the time. Now, I don't know how often they're doing it in the Taiping Guangji because I haven't read the stories yet, and here's a dirty secret that I haven't articulated to you previously. You may notice that there's not a single story that has to do with Xin or Bu Xin in Hong Mai that ends in uncertainty. It's only the stories that have to do with surmise or supposition that end in uncertainty, that contain those words. So what's that about? That's an aspect of this that I don't know how to think about yet, but that has to be thought about. Because it's as if the appearance of the word Xin or Bu Xin in the story excludes the possibility of an uncertain ending. That's what it looks like at this point. Whereas these other terms don't exclude it. And that's a very interesting pattern. And it seems to be a pattern, I don't know if it's a pattern in the Taiping Guangji yet, because all I know is in the Taiping Guangji, since I only looked at stories that contained the word Xin, I know that I didn't find any that seemed to me to end in uncertainty, so that seems to be the same zero you find in Hong Mai's case, but what happens when I look at stories that contain surmise and so on without the words Xin or Bu Xin in them, it could end up being 34 out of 215 like in Hong Mai, or it could end up being 0. So I don't know. That could be something else that changed. It could be that Taiping Guangji stories don't end in uncertainty, for instance. And Song stories and Hong Mai stories do. That would be a very interesting other change. But at this point, I couldn't tell you. At this point, I would speculate that the picture is about the same in the Taiping Guangji, just based on having gotten that 0 in that cell for both of them. But you can't deduce that way probably. But the uncertainty thing is a very interesting problem, and the way that it obviously articulates very directly with Xin and Bu Xin, but like two positives or negatives repelling each other. The one excludes the other is very interesting too, and I have no idea what it means. So speculations are welcome.
Okay, we have time for one short question.
So I really like what you said about the connection between the collapse of trust interpersonally and the collapse of this sort of belief system. I wonder if there's sort of something that's sort of slipping under the surface of the conversation, which is that you have Hong Mai, who's presenting a set of stories in which when you believe, you're almost always wrong, yet he's offering these stories to a public and telling them to believe. And I wonder if There's like an interesting thing going on there where the evidence says that people in this time, elites, don't believe what they're told. But the conceit of the project is, I collected these with great care, and please believe me. So is that just
it's a
genre thing, or is it?
It's a very good question. First of all, remember that if he's urging people to believe this, remember that they're always wrong when they disbelieve too. So if he's saying believe me and it gives you 62 stories where 62 times the guy disbelieves is wrong, that doesn't fit that badly anymore. But the point I would really make, which I think is the central one, is that it's not the same thing. And here's how it's not. In the story, a guy meets a god. He doesn't believe it's a god. He's wrong. In another story, a guy meets a god, and the god tells him something, and he believes what the god tells him, but he's wrong because the god has tricked him. But those are both stories that are evidence for the existence of God, actually. They're both, don't disbelieve that the gods exist, and on the other hand, don't believe everything they tell you, because actually this one's a demon. So, okay, I believe there's a demon. Well, if you've bought into demons, you've bought into the whole picture. So I think it's perfectly consistent for him to be presenting this as a body of material where he's in effect saying, don't assume 100% of this stuff is true. Instead, do as I have done with some cases, which is to check it, to go look at other sources and see and find cases that clearly are not right. But as a body, he uses the phrase, don't allow a single phrase to ruin the sense of the whole text or something like that. And what that means is don't allow a single story that's wrong to ruin the meaning of this whole collection. As a whole body, this is talking about stuff that happens. And one of the reasons you need to know this stuff happens is because, in fact, demons and gods and lie all the time, and they play nasty tricks on people, and they do evil things. Not gods so much, but demons, ghosts, do nasty things. And he doesn't come out and say this, but I think one reason he thinks this is an important body of material in the world to be aware of is that but by God, it's really there, and it's no good pretending that it's not. So I do think that message is perfectly consistent with the fact that people are mostly wrong when they disbelieve and wrong when they believe in the stories. It shows that that's just like saying bad things happen. You could present a set of murder cases and tell people don't kill, right? And take a position on it. He's taking a position on this material, on the existence of the stuff, these kinds of beings as a whole, not on whether any of them in particular are truthful or not, which he abundantly shows they aren't, and others are. Life in the world of demons and gods and ghosts is tricky, just as life in the world of men is, humans is tricky.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks a lot. A lot of fun.